Deathcore is popular now more than ever, but it also became extremely diversified over the years. From bands like Psychoframe to Lorna Shore, the term Deathcore now encapsulates a very large spectrum of sounds. I mean, don't you think it's a little weird that Deathcore can sound like this? But also like that? And don't get me wrong, they're both great, it's just a matter of taste and opinion, but today, I feel like it's time to explore all the different forms of deathcore together. So my friend, as usual, take a cup of coffee, a cigarette, apple pie, whatever you feel like, as we dive into the different kinds of deathcore. Before starting the video, I just want to say thank you to all my Patreon. You guys are the best and you're supporting me so much more than you think. When you subscribe on Patreon, you get exclusive content, early access, and on top of that, if you're in a band and you want me to listen to your songs on Twitch while I'm streaming, this might be interesting for you. Also, feel free to join our Discord, the link is in the description. And we have our live Deathcore podcast on Twitch every Wednesday. With all that being said, let's start the video. So first, keep in mind that the terms I'll be using to describe each form of deathcore won't be official by any means, it's simply a good way to showcase each variation from my own perspective, and hopefully we can talk about it in the comments afterwards. Let's kick off the video with a classic, brutal deathcore. This one is a very early form of deathcore. We're talking 2005, 2006, with bands like Suicide Silence and Job for a Cowboy. I call it brutal deathcore because it sounded so much like brutal death metal back then. And deathcore wasn't even a thing, so all those bands were inspired by the death metal scene. Bands like Defilement, Dying Fetus, Suffocation. It was basically an over-the-top, extreme version of brutal death metal with the addition of breakdowns, which came from classic metal bands like Slayer and Pantera. So take the same concept, but with extreme vocals and a lower tuning, and this is what you get. They created their own version of brutal death with the energy and culture that the hardcore scene had at the time. The goal was simply to make the most extreme music ever, and none of them really realized that they were creating something new. I think the biggest difference between brutal deathcore and brutal death metal, besides the breakdowns, would be the vocals. The contrast between the high-pitched vocals and the low gutturals really created a new sound, a new take on extreme metal, if you will. And talking about new sound, I have to mention the MySpace revival because I think I would classify it in the brutal deathcore section. Bands like I Saw God, Restricted, Girl of Glass, Dustspoke, and tons of other amazing newer deathcore bands who perfectly understood what it was and really captured the essence of old school deathcore. On top of that, now we have bands doing it with a more modern production like Psychoframe. To me, Psychoframe is the most innovative, craziest form of deathcore out there. They have the perfect amount of rawness while being extremely well produced. Shout out to Hunter Young, who's a freaking mastermind. We even have OG deathcore bands returning to their roots like Whitechapel and Molotov Solution, which is very exciting. I would also include slam-oriented bands in the brutal deathcore category, like Nine Dead and Slamwish. Those bands are kind of in the middle between deathcore and slam, mixing elements from both worlds. The main difference would be the breakdowns, which are not really present in brutal death metal, and again, it's very debatable. And for these bands specifically, besides the slam scene like Peeling Flesh and all those amazing bands, I think Waking the Cadaver might be the biggest influence. They were kind of the first brutal death metal band to ever include deathcore elements like breakdowns and big squeals in their music, which is, I think, the reason why people are still debating to this day if they're deathcore or not. And again, I think people are arguing because the line is so thin, so blurry between brutal deathcore and brutal death metal. Does it matter? Not so much, but let's go back to the brutal deathcore conversation here. Brutal deathcore is definitely one of my personal favorites. It's no secret, I talk about it all the time in my videos. I think it's the scariest, more menacing forms of deathcore out there, but it's kind of missing the hardcore elements. Don't get me wrong, a lot of those bands had hardcore riffs, but very few of them made it a major part of their sound, which brings us to the second form of deathcore, the hardcore influenced deathcore. The biggest difference here, of course, is the hardcore sound and riff being a major part of the music while still keeping the death metal side of it. By definition, deathcore is a combination of hardcore and death metal, so technically to call a band deathcore, they're supposed to have hardcore elements in it. I think the reason why it's so confusing for most people is, in some cases, the hardcore parts are very clear and very present, while for other bands it's more of a vibe, more of a feeling in it. But in this specific form of deathcore, the hardcore elements are a major part of the sound. That's why I'm calling it hardcore influenced deathcore. I sincerely believe that the hardcore roots are crucial in deathcore, you know? Back during the MySpace era, when everything started, all the bands would write in their description death metal, hardcore. It was half of it. The best example of a band perfectly combining hardcore and death metal would be Despised Icon. I mean, they're the godfather of deathcore. They were doing it in like 2002, 2003, you know? It was the perfect clash, the perfect duality of both worlds, and they're still doing it to this day. But you know what? I think it goes beyond the music itself. I mean, the shows, the energy, the ambience, the mosh pits. It's so much closer to the hardcore scene than it ever was to death metal, in my opinion. That's why I believe it's so important to keep the hardcore roots. And talking about that, one of the best bands to ever do it, in my opinion, besides Despised Icon, of course, would be the Acacia Strain. They perfectly nailed the hardcore vibes while having a lot of deathcore elements, especially during the early days. Musically, I'd say the hardcore influenced deathcore bands were heavily influenced by Terror, Madball, and Converge. The most iconic hardcore elements would be the gang vocals, and obviously the two steps. The cool thing is, we're lucky enough to have newer bands with strong hardcore roots like Body Snatcher and Tracheotomy. Another band that deserves a lot of credit for bringing back the OG sound. I mean, to me, they're right on top with Psycho Frame. Simon really has a powerful voice and every single song they release is a banger. And again, please keep in mind that most of the bands featured in the video could be part of multiple categories, like Despice Icon could easily fit the brutal deathcore section, for example. It's more of a way to showcase all the styles, if you will, more than classify each band. Does that make sense? I mean, for instance, I've included the revival scene in the brutal deathcore section, but some of those bands have killer hardcore riffs. Which brings us to a very similar form of deathcore, the Beatdown. Probably one of the heaviest forms of deathcore, back when every single guitar player would trade their instrument for an 8-string guitar, down-tuned to the extreme. The goal was to create the slowest breakdowns with the bounciest riffs and the most extreme vocals, obviously. But I personally think it started a couple years before that with bands like Demolisher, Structures, and Monsters. But most importantly, Float Face Down, an incredible band that in my opinion pioneered beatdown in deathcore music. I would say it was the pre-gent era, back when both metalcore bands and deathcore bands were starting to include bouncy parts in their music. Which I believe was mostly inspired by Immure. I know, very controversial take. And don't get me wrong, I'm fully aware that gent and beatdown are two very different things, but since this video is about every single kind of deathcore, I thought I would give a bit of context here. So in other words, beatdown is a down-tempo, very slow, heavy form of deathcore with tons of breakdowns and gutturals, creating a dark atmosphere with a strong hardcore vibe. And now, my friends, it's time to go further back when one of the very first forms of deathcore was created, the melodic deathcore or at the gate core. This one has so many metalcore influences that people are still debating if they're metalcore or deathcore. To this day, I swear I cannot make a video about one of those bands without people arguing in the comments. I would say their biggest influences back then would be As I Lay Dying and At the Gates. Which is probably why you could hear those same kinds of riffs in metalcore. But I think the main difference was that there was no clean singing in it, the tempo was faster, and the vocals were way more extreme. The fact that this style was closer to metalcore really made it more accessible and appealing to a wider audience, which I think was a very good thing for the scene back then. I'm pretty sure it's also the reason why some of those bands literally became metalcore later on. So all in all, melodic deathcore is a classic that we don't hear as much nowadays, unfortunately. At least we've got the revival scene bringing some of those riffs back, so I guess time will tell to which extent. And now, my friends, the next kind of deathcore we're gonna talk about became a lost art at this point. The technical deathcore. This is probably the most impressive way of doing deathcore. I mean, every single member needs to master their instrument, and it's a level that many won't even reach through their entire career. It's that intense. I would say this one is mostly defined by its incredible speed and technicality, especially on drums and guitar, which makes it a much less accessible kind of deathcore. Probably the least accessible kind of deathcore, now that I think about it. I mean, as much as the death metal community wanted to hate on deathcore back then, the talent was just undeniable with those bands. And while we're here, I have to mention one of my favorite technical deathcore bands of all time, Silence the Inn. Silence the Inn was an amazing band from Australia, like most technical deathcore back then, and I really want to make a video about them, so if any of you can put me in contact with a member, maybe. I don't have much information. Here's what I know. Those were the logos they were using, and they later on changed their name for Pray for Death. So again, if you have any information or if you can put me in contact, please let me know in the comments. Also, it's impossible for me to talk about technical deathcore without mentioning Infinite Death by Dirt is Murder, which I think is one of the best deathcore records of all time. And I think we could also easily include cybergrind bands like We Came with Broken Teeth, and I Am Error. All those crazy Nintendo core bands self-recording music on MySpace that was so fast and technical that, if we're being honest, was almost impossible to play. And talking about impossible to play, Infant Annihilator is probably the biggest technical deathcore band at the moment. They're killing it. Everybody's talking about them, but the scene itself became smaller over time. We don't have many bands doing this specific style of deathcore. That being said, I would highly recommend checking out some tech death bands like Archspire. It's not exactly the same, but it's pretty close. And now, my friends, as we all know, I couldn't make this video without mentioning the most popular kind of deathcore, Blackened deathcore. This one is mostly inspired by black metal, obviously. The orchestral elements are usually a big part of their sound, and the whole thing is a little more theatrical, I would say. But before getting into it, I have to mention Carnifex because I think they've always been heavily influenced by black metal, both in terms of aesthetic and music. It's cool to see that they finally got the attention they deserved after all those years, but to me, it should have happened way before that. As you probably already know, I wouldn't consider myself a black metal fan by any means. That being said, In terms of Blackened Deathcore, I'm pretty sure their biggest influences would be bands like Behemoth, Dimmy Borgir, Cradle of Filth. What's very interesting to me is that a lot of Blackened Deathcore bands are using a pop structure in their songs, which isn't bad at all, but it's kind of surprising for Deathcore because it makes the whole thing a little more predictable as opposed to surprising and raw. I mean, the breakdown is usually placed at the exact same part of the song, they have repeating riffs, so it's very different in that way. That being said, it's not like we've never seen that in the early days of Deathcore. The song Wake Up or even Disengage by Suicide Silence are both really good examples of that. As for the orchestral elements, I have to mention Winds of Plague because they were doing it very early on. In my opinion, they were ahead of their time and they deserve a lot of credit for what they've done in the scene. They actually influenced tons of amazing deathcore bands using synths in their music and their sound. It was awesome. Another very important thing to mention is that Blackened Deathcore became the most popular form of deathcore because of this. And I mean no disrespect at all, Lorna Shore deserve all the success that they have. They've been at it for a long time and it's cool to see them on top of the scene. I'm just saying that the over-the-top vocals might be the biggest reason why it's so popular now. I'm not saying it's a bad thing at all those vocalists are extremely talented. I'm just saying it's a big part of the appeal and probably the reason why it's grabbing people's attention even outside of the scene. But besides the crazy breakdowns and vocals, musically I would say it's the closest to death metal, technically, and I think it's a good thing in terms of exposure because more and more death metal fans are starting to like these deathcore bands. Which brings us to another very popular form of deathcore, the nu metal deathcore. I'm calling it like that because if you would take a band like Slipknot and somehow make it deathcore, this is kind of what you would get. I mean, even the videos are screaming nu metal. Musically, I would say it's as groovy and bouncy as Beatdown deathcore, but faster and more chaotic, if that makes sense. And while we're here, I have to give credit to Emior because I'm pretty sure they were the first band using clear nu metal elements in their music. What did you expect? You thought you really got to know me, better hold your breath. Obviously, they got a lot of hate back then for doing that, but it's now undeniable how influential and important they always were in our scene, right? And I know a lot of people are gonna come at me saying that Emior isn't deathcore, but if you were around during the MySpace era, you know for a fact that they were part of the same scene. As for nu metal deathcore, I know the term isn't right, but I'm pretty sure you all understood what I meant by that, and that's the important part. The cool thing is that it's getting bigger and bigger by the day, with Slaughter to Prevail being arguably as popular as Lorna Shore at the moment, and the music itself is very groovy and over the top and bouncy, so people even outside of metal could listen to that as they're going to the gym, for example. I don't know if it makes sense, but that's kind of my best way to explain it. And also, I believe that it's a very good format for festivals. If you've seen Slaughter to Prevail performing, it works, you know, it works as well as new metal bands back in the days. And that would be pretty much it. I really hope this video is accurate for the most part somehow. My goal was simply to give context to newer people coming in the deathcore scene, as well as possibly spark conversations with old people like me. I'm fully aware that a lot of you are gonna think, how could he possibly make a video about this and not talk about that band or not include this specific thing? I understand, but please keep in mind that it's literally impossible for me to include every single band in every single video. I still invite you to comment because it's awesome. I love talking to you guys. I love reading your stories and all of that. I'm just saying, maybe keep that in mind. Thank you so much for watching. It truly means the world to me. As usual, if you enjoyed the video, please leave a like and subscribe to the channel. Again, feel free to comment your opinion, your stories, or even if you think that I'm wrong, it's completely fine. I'm inviting you to do that. Check out my Patreon if you want your name to appear in the video, exclusive content, and just support me to a higher level. Feel free to join our Discord and hang out with us during our live Deathcore podcast every Wednesday on Twitch. With all that being said, I'm finally gonna stop talking. I'll see you in the next one.